Hello and welcome to the History Programme. Today, historian Georgia Brown will be covering for us how the people of England reacted to Elizabeth's decision to re-establish the Anglican Church between 1559 and 1603. Without further ado, I will pass on to Georgia.
Hello and thanks for having me. Well, Elizabeth became Queen of England in 1558, when she was 25 years old. She was only the third queen to rule England, and the two women who had ruled before her were unsuccessful to say the least. The young new queen was to inherit a bankrupt land, split by religion and weakened by the great powers France and Spain. The circumstances were not in her favour, yet Elizabeth I is now claimed to be the greatest monarch in English history. Her quick decision to re-establish the Anglican Church after she came to power can be seen as one of the many fine decisions she made as Queen. We are going to explore the reactions the English people had to the religious settlement from 1559 to 1603. Religious turmoil had been created by the previous rulers, Henry, Edward and Mary. To respond to the religious decisions, Elizabeth began the Revolution of 1559. The religious settlement included two acts set out in Parliament, the Act of Uniformity and the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Uniformity set out forms of worship and introduced the new prayer book, whereas the Supremacy Act introduced Elizabeth as the new head of the English Church, replacing the Pope. A way to gain better knowledge of the religious settlement is to look at the change through the eyes of the many different people of England. The change is better understood when reviewing it from some of the many different religious perspectives that there were at the time. One of the most prominent religious groups during the time was the Catholics. Elizabeth's decision to re-establish the Anglican Church led to some very negative reactions from this group. They believed that the Pope was the head of the Church, and that Elizabeth, also being a woman, did not deserve the title. It was completely against their beliefs. Many Catholics left the Church rather than taking the oath of supremacy. Bishop Scott of Chester, in his speech against the Supremacy Bill in March 1559, said, "And as for the certainty of our faith, whereof the story of the Church doth speak, a thing of all other most necessary, if it shall hang upon the Act of Parliament, we have built a weak staff to lean unto." Obviously unhappy with the new Supremacy Act, many Catholics carried out Catholic services despite the new changes. They believed that the use of sacred images, candles, music, investments and worship. These are all symbols to display how great God is. However, the new faith meant that these symbols were taken away, as the symbols were worshipped, not God. Protestants thought that the service in the interior of the church should be simple, so that the people would concentrate on the message. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth and absolved her subjects from their allegiance to her. All Catholics were told not to obey her, and if they did, they could be excommunicated also. This action was an invitation for any Catholic countries to invade England. This made Mary much more of a threat, as now there was an emphasis on Elizabeth's illegitimacy. Mary was, in the eye of the Catholics, the best alternative. Catholic rituals were also still being performed. Secret night services were held. However, many Catholics still attended the compulsory Protestant services as to avoid fines and any issues with the authorities. For example, two leaders of the Northern Rebellion, Thomas Percy and Charles Neville, were still celebrating Mass in Durham Cathedral in 1569. The Northern Rebellion of 1569 was an attempt by Catholic nobles from northern England to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. Thomas Percy and Charles Neville were the two that led the rebellion. Mary Queen of Scots was highly involved in the many plots against Elizabeth after the re-establishment of the Church. For Catholics that did not support Elizabeth, for many did, Mary Queen of Scots was the best alternative, as she was Catholic. In their eyes, Elizabeth was an illegitimate ruler, so they thought that she should have been replaced with Mary. This is what the Pope encouraged. Mary joined with these many supporters to come up with plans to replace Elizabeth as Queen of England. The Babington Plot of 1586 was a planned assassination of Elizabeth I so that she could be replaced by Mary.
This led to Mary's execution, as she was too strongly tied to the plot, and Elizabeth could no longer overlook her as a threat. She reluctantly signed her death warrant. Mary was also involved in the Northern Rebellion, the Rodolphi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and the Babington plot. Catholics devised many plots against Elizabeth. As explained before, the Northern Rebellion was an effort by Catholic nobles from northern England to defeat Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. The Rodolphi plot of 1571 was hatched by Robert de Rodolphi. Rodolphi was an international banker, making it easy to travel to different places and to gather support without being noticed. He thought to murder Elizabeth so Mary could take her place as queen. Rodolphi had been planning to overthrow Elizabeth since 1569 and was involved in the Northern Rebellion. He realised that an uprising would not be successful unless he had support from people overseas. The Duke of Alba was to invade England through the Netherlands with 10,000 men, with more support from Catholics in the north. They were going to kill Elizabeth and get Mary to marry Thomas Howard. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 was a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. Sir Francis Throckmorton was the key conspirator and confessed to the plot when he was tortured. Throckmorton was a Spanish agent. The plan was to attack England, led by Henry I, Duke of Guise, and it was to be financed by Spain and the Pope. The Babington plot of 1586 was to have Spain invade England so that the Catholic faith could be restored to England. Sir Anthony Babington, a young Catholic noble, was the chief conspirator. The actual designers were situated in Madrid and Paris. The plan was to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. All of these plots had the same ideas. Some Puritans did not agree with the new religious settlement also. Puritans were not a movement, instead a way of thinking, a mentality. They were still involved in the Church of England. Puritans spent a lot of time reading the Bible and praying. They thought that their relationship with God was the most important priority. They preferred to dress in black, grey, and brown gowns instead of wearing anything bright. Puritans also tried to live a godly life, often thinking about sin. They tried to purify the church as they disagreed with many aspects. They did not think that the church should be used as a place for fundraising, social gatherings, drinking, or buying and selling. They thought that the priests had too much power in the church, and that all people could have a close personal relationship with God as long as they read the Bible and lived a pure religious life. Puritans wanted to see the end of the use of the prayer book, and tried to outlaw it in 1645. As the more radical Puritan sects began to have an influence, a steady change in church vandalism was seen. In 1563, a group of Puritan ministers introduced articles designed to eliminate Catholic features from the church. They called for the removal of organs in churches and abandonment of holy days, except for Sunday and the principal feasts. They felt that ceremonies such as kneeling to receive for communion and signing with the cross in baptism should be left to the discretion of the minister. Concerns were taken when the bishop exercised the royal supremacy to remove dispute from their dioceses, to which John Bartlett wrote against, saying, "The lordship of bishops now exercised over both the rest of the clergy and over the lay people hath no ground in the word of God. Christ is the only head of his mystical body, which is the church." A new version of the prayer book that was less Protestant was helpful in the fact that it was easier for Catholics to accept England's new faith. This prayer book was a revision of the old prayer book used in 1552. It was somewhat less Protestant than the older version and allowed Catholics to accept the new change more easily. Elizabeth kept aspects of the Catholic faith in the new church settlement, which meant that it helped minimise the negative reactions from Catholics. Separatists did also not agree with the new settlement. While Puritans opposed the hierarchy of the bishops and believed in a Presbyterian system, Separatists wanted each congregation to exist by itself. Separatists encouraged others to leave the church so that they could set up their own pure assemblies to where only saints could be accepted.
They wanted the doctrine and worship to be rid of all superstition. Robert Brown and Robert Harrison formed a separatist congregation in Norwich. Henry Barrow and John Greenwood, two other separatists, set up a congregation in London in 1592. The two were then arrested and hanged in 1593. Many English people accepted the religious settlement. A lot of English people thought that it was more important to obey the monarch than to follow their own beliefs, so continued attending church just as they had done previously without feeling angry. With William Cecil, Elizabeth produced a church settlement which was national, Protestant, yet sufficiently flexible not to distance English Catholics en masse. Thereafter, by refusing to allow tests of conscience by obligatory attendance at Anglican communion, she did not drive many people to desperate hostility, resistance, or even treason. The idea that God's love and forgiveness was given to all was a relief to many people. This helped them to accept Protestantism. The Bible was also published in English. This meant that English people were able to read the Bible themselves rather than relying on the interpretation of priests. Elizabeth made a religious settlement that had both aspects of the two main religions in England to try to keep as many people happy as possible. An uneasy compromise was reached. Although Puritans were aggravated by the remaining Catholic elements, they could not complain as progress was being made. By pursuing a policy of moderation, Elizabeth was attempting to maintain the status quo. The tradition of candlesticks, clerical robes, and crucifixes was kept for the Catholics. The fact that the services had remained the same in churches, remained in the same churches, ones that were used for Catholic services, may have helped to preserve some of the old worship styles. So it can be seen that there were many different reactions to Elizabeth's decision to re-establish the Anglican Church. The groups that had the biggest reactions to this settlement were the Catholics, Puritans, and Separatists. This was due mainly to the differences in beliefs, and they thought that some changes needed to be made to the settlement. Luckily, though, Elizabeth kept aspects of the Catholic faith in the new church, so it settled some discontent that was felt among the groups. The new settlement was generally accepted by all English people, although this acceptance was not exactly felt across other nations, especially Catholic ones. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that I have answered any questions you may have had.
Thank you, Georgia. That was a very interesting and perceptive. See you next time on the History Program.